Good evening from Jakarta. Welcome to tonight's public discussion with FPCI. I am Abda, a researcher at the Habibi Center, and I will be moderating tonight's discussion. This public discussion is brought to you by Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia and the United States Embassy in Jakarta, and is a part of the Women in Foreign Policy public discussion series. The Women in Foreign Policy is a program collaboration between FPCI and the United States Embassy in Jakarta with an objective to highlight, increase, and advance Indonesian women participation in foreign policy conversations in the country. The WFP Public Discussion Series will feature participation of FPCI Women in Foreign Policy Fellows who are rising women foreign policy thinkers in Indonesia, alongside experts and thought leaders in the field. And I'm happy to say that I am one among the 20 fellows who have participated in the two-day Indonesian Women in Foreign Policy Forum. And in today's discussion, we will discuss the Quad and what it means for ASEAN. The Quad was revived in 2017 at the sideline of the ASEAN and East Asia Summit, subsequently marking a stark change in the US approach to multilateralism in Asia Pacific in at least two directions. First was the US inclination towards unilateralism, and second, the Indo-Pacific becoming a much more prominent geopolitical lexicon. Over the years, these developments have drawn various responses from individual member states of ASEAN. And collectively, ASEAN agreed upon and will begin to streamline the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific. Underlying all of these developments is concerns over China's rise and its growing influence, particularly in Southeast Asia. And ultimately, the question that we will be reflecting upon in today's discussion is, what does it all mean to the regional order? Ladies and gentlemen, to address these developments, today's public discussion will feature renowned and highly regarded women in the foreign policy circle. We are joined by Ambassador Piper Campbell, the director of the ASEAN Studies Initiative at the School of International Service, the American University, and she has 30 years worth of experience as a diplomat, including in leading the US mission to ASEAN. We also have Professor Dewi Fortuna Anwar, who is a research professor at the National Research and Innovation Agency, a board member of FPCI, and the chairperson of the Habibi Center. Together with us is also Ms. Elina Noor, a senior fellow in the Asia program at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and she's previously spent most of her career at the Institute of Strategic and International Studies, or ISIS Malaysia. And last but not least, we have Ibu Penny Hanggarini, also an FPCI Women in Foreign Policy Fellow and a doctoral candidate at the Republic of Indonesia Defense University. Welcome, and before we begin, I would like to note that you are welcome to raise questions throughout the discussion, either through the chat box and Q&A box, or you will also be given the chance to directly ask your questions on your own during the Q&A session for those joining from Zoom. And to start off the discussion, we will begin with opening remarks from each of the speakers. And I would like to begin with asking a very simple question for each of the speakers. How would you describe recent developments revolving the Quad? And what do you think has been the most interesting development that you have observed? So I will hand the screen to Ambassador Piper to begin her opening remarks. So each of the speakers will have 4 minutes to provide their thoughts on the question. So Ambassador, please.
Yes, thank you so much. And I really appreciate FPCI for inviting me to be part of this session tonight, because I think the Women in Foreign Policy discussion series is wonderful and really important. And I'm going to gush for just a moment and to say I'm really honored and privileged to be on a panel with Dewi Fortuna Anwar, somebody who I've admired for a long time and who I have my students read, and Elina Noor likewise, and I look forward, Ibu Penny, to get to know you more during tonight's discussion. I was thinking about the relationship between the Quad and ASEAN from 3 different levels of analysis. And from 2 of those levels, I think that from ASEAN's perspective, the strengthening of the Quad over time is actually a positive thing for ASEAN and for ASEAN-US relations. But then there's a middle level where I think the presence of the Quad and the increased activism of the Quad in the region is perhaps less helpful to ASEAN. So I thought I'd start by kind of providing that framing. And so my three levels of analysis, or the three perspectives that I'm coming from, are kind of the interests of ASEAN as a bureaucracy, the ASEAN Secretariat, or the structures of the organization. A second level of analysis is the interests of the countries in Southeast Asia. And then the third is the interests of those countries when they're within the ASEAN formation. So from the perspective of ASEAN as a bureaucracy, or the ASEAN Secretariat, I think that the existence and the strengthening of the Quad over time, and of course we're going to see the next Quad summit in just a few days, I guess about a week away. From that perspective, I think that although the Quad is still informal in terms of not having a bureaucratic structure of its own, but rather being supported by the bureaucracies of the four member states, I think it still provides an organizational framework for interaction between the member states of the Quad and structures of ASEAN. So I see that as positive, and I think we can speak to that more during the discussion. From the perspective of the countries of Southeast Asia, something that as a US diplomat, I certainly heard often during my career, is there is a real interest in the region in seeing the United States present in the region, engaged in the region, showing up at the meetings, understanding the desires and the structures of Southeast Asia. And I think you can see within the Quad structure a renewed US commitment to the region, a new set of engagements that are pulling and keeping the US in the region. And that is in the interests of the countries of Southeast Asia as countries. So those two are the positive aspects or perspectives on the Quad. The third, however, is that for ASEAN, for the 10, soon to be 11 countries of ASEAN, their convening power, the idea of ASEAN centrality, is such an important part of what makes ASEAN fascinating. And as a US diplomat, explaining ASEAN to people coming from Washington, this idea that we, the Americans, were going to go into a structure where the 10 members of ASEAN had actually already developed the agenda, had a common view as to how they wanted to engage. And it was the United States engaging with the 10, engaging with that structure. I think that gave ASEAN something very important. It's useful to remember that the Quad had an inauspicious beginning in 2017. You referenced the fact that it occurred in the sort of margins of ASEAN. And that was really sort of pulling away from what was meant to be an ASEAN-led, ASEAN-organized set of meetings, to have 4 of the members of the East Asia Summit trotting off to the side and having a meeting on their own, and then actually releasing a statement about that meeting even before the ASEAN structure statement came out. So that was awkward. And some of that awkwardness remains in this question about how the four countries coordinating among themselves, what that does to sort of the balance. And I don't want to say the balance of power. It's not a question of balance of power, but rather the balance of control of the agenda within this dynamic of the 4 members of Quad, their individual relationships with ASEAN, but then their relationship as a mini-lateral with this important regional organization. And I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ambassador. And I believe that the 2 points that you raised previously, which are the interest of the countries in the Southeast Asia, the individual countries, as well as the countries within ASEAN, are the 2 points that I've seen Professor Dewi has raised a lot in some of her writings. So, and that's a nice segue to the next speaker, Professor Anwar. So what are your takes on the developments that you have seen in the Quad?
Yeah, Well, thank you very much. Again, it's an honor and a privilege to be here, and I'm happy to be the second speaker after Piper. So you have set up very nicely that framework. Now, I have to say from the outset, I don't have a strong view about the Quad. You might say that I'm an agnostic about the Quad. I can take it or leave it, but you can see that. The perceptions about the Quad has also evolved over time. Piper mentioned about the awkwardness about 2017, the coming up of the Quad, and you can see that the perception of the ASEAN member states were very ambivalent, and I think it continues to be ambivalent about that. On the one hand, ASEAN provides forums for minilaterals. So the fact that the 4 countries met in ASEAN forums, it's also a plus for ASEAN. The fact that they provide the revival of the Quad, which has been existed since the early 2000s, but has not really done very much since then. But the perception at the time was that this was a minilateral in response to China. So the general perception of this was a containment of China policy. And at the same time, a lot of ASEAN countries were very worried about the new assertiveness of China, that the one that had engaged ASEAN in a very soft, sort of a velvet gloves type of things. And then there's a sea change in policies in 2017. So the perceptions toward the Quad, reflected this ambivalence. Now, if I like to look, I've looked at the State of Southeast Asia survey that's carried out by the ISIS, Yusuf Isa Institute. In 2020, there is almost a clear divide between those who saw the Quad as this positive, it's about 31.1% at the ASEAN level, and negative at 19.6%, but nearly 50%, 49.3%, it says, it's just neutral. It could have either positive or negative impact. And interestingly, at the ASEAN level, would ASEAN countries be willing to participate in the Quad? At the ASEAN level, it says, no at 38.4% and yes at 61.6%. But Indonesia is really truly more divided. No was at 49.3% and yes at 50.7%. The perceptions of Quad improved quite substantially in 2022 when the Quad carried out activities in non-traditional security issues. Particularly regarding the availability of vaccines and also on climate change and so on. So when the Quad decided to change its image, not as a containment of China strategy, but rather as a purveyor of public goods on issues that are of importance to the region as a whole, on vaccines and climate change, et cetera, the positive perceptions went up. At the ASEAN level, strongly agree and agree it's only went up to 58%. But in Indonesia, it went even further. The strongly agree to agree, positively, it's at 64.9%. And then the people who regarded the Quad in a more neutral manner, at ASEAN level, it's at 28.5%. And Indonesia is at 23.7%. So, it really went down from the one who, could care less about the Quad. The positive sign was at 64.9%. But wait for it, now that people are coming back to normalcy, the COVID is hopefully it's more or less behind us, and the US-China rivalry is again, the main topic. And you can also see perceptions also change. In 2023, the strengthening of the Quad is still viewed positively as a whole. At the ASEAN level, 50.4% strongly agree that that the strengthening of Quad is positive and reassuring for ASEAN. But that meant that it went down from 58% in the previous year. Now for Indonesia, the decline is even sharper. Remember the previous year, the positive attitude was at 64.9%. In 2023, it went down to 51.3%. So it's still positive, but it's gone down. And the neutral position for Indonesia has gone up from 23.7% to 33.9%. So this is like in 2020 again. So that means that there is a strong support for the Quad for, if the Quad is involved in non-traditional security issues, which involves all countries, it's a more positive sum game. But there are still some concerns, if the Quad is going to be involved in the more geopolitical, geopolitical, in the more traditional security area. Now, myself, if you're asking me, I tend to be, as I said, more neutral, but tends to be a more positive one. I see that as the Quad can supplement and complement what ASEAN does, in various areas that is of importance to the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Anwar. And you giving a lot of references to this Southeast Asia survey. We will probably return to some of the results that you have outlined, and it's really interesting to see that you have noted that the increase or the decrease in the support is truly interesting to see. And we will also proceed with the opening remark from Ms. Elena Noor. So Ms. Noor, please, what are your thoughts on recent developments in the Quad? Ms. Noor, please.
Thank you. I was just typing to say that I was having trouble unmuting myself, so thank you for unmuting me. I want to add my gratitude to being a part of this and also echo how honored I am to be following both Ibu Dewi and Ambassador Campbell in this lineup, and I am very much looking forward to hearing Ibu Penny's thoughts as well. Let me offer 3 points, some of which are questions maybe, in response to your prompt, Mabda. So I think for me, the evolution of the Quad since its reinvigoration in 2021 has been interesting to see. And this, for me, is reflected in both the rhetoric and some of the substantive ideas that have been put forward by the Quad. A lot of that, of course, is influenced by the leadership of the Quad at the time. And I think you can see that very clearly in the language of the statements, the leader statements in particular, over the years. But that evolution and development has been really fascinating for me. So for example, of course, at the height of COVID, we heard a lot about vaccine diplomacy. The reality fell a little short because of logistical issues, but that focus on responding to COVID-19 has turned into something broader to address public health emergencies. Likewise, the recent foreign minister's statement that came out in March in Delhi, I think speaks very loudly about how Quad leaders have been listening to those of us in Southeast Asia about the Quad not being mainly about China, not solely about China. And I thought it was particularly interesting that the wording of the foreign minister's statement references how the Quad will be guided in its work by ASEAN principles and priorities. This will be seen, of course, how flesh will be put to the bones, but I think the inclusion of that phrase itself in that statement is telling of how much has been taken on by Quad leaders with regard to the voices that have been coming out from Southeast Asia, but also perhaps from Pacific Island countries. So Many of us in Southeast Asia are still very much aware that there are competitive undertones in the Quad's motivations, drives, but that has been tempered a lot in both the working groups and the initiatives that have come out of the Quad's working groups, as well as the language of these statements. I would add a note of caution, though, because domestic politics will always have an influence in foreign policy, as we all know. And so as we approach the 2024 presidential elections in the United States, there is a possibility, faint or otherwise, of some of these initiatives and focus of the Quad being diluted perhaps by the dynamics, the domestic dynamics in Congress in the US, but also largely within the political circles of the US. And there's also still the trauma of the US having pulled out of multilateral institutions in recent years, and whether that is going to be repeated next year and in the years to come will, of course, be watched very carefully by the region. Now, my final point relates to ASEAN. And of course, we're here to discuss what does the Quad mean for us in ASEAN. And that is the key question. Part of that question also relates to the branding of the Quad. There are many, many initiatives that are being worked cooperatively and collaboratively by individual Quad countries with ASEAN as a whole, but also with individual Southeast Asian countries. And whether the Quad as a collective chooses to brand that as brand any of those initiatives as Quad cooperative mechanisms, or whether they choose to just go with it as individual forms of cooperation, I think is beside the point. The point is that there are these different mechanisms of cooperation being carried out. And one of those that falls within one of the Quad categories and working groups relates to pandemic and public health emergencies. So for example, Japan is partnering with ASEAN has been partnering with ASEAN in the establishment, but also the running of the ASEAN Center on Public Health Emergencies and Emerging Diseases. It's the acronym, as is typical of ASEAN, is very long, but things like that are going on, and that's something we have to keep in mind. The other sub-question to the larger question of what the Quad means for ASEAN, of course, is how can ASEAN leverage from these Quad initiatives proactively, actively, whether it wishes to do so, whether it wishes to remain ambivalent or agnostic, as Ibu Dewi herself has pointed out, and how it can port some of these Quad initiatives to its own initiatives, regardless of how it feels about the Quad. And I think there are opportunities to leverage on what the Quad is doing, particularly on the climate front, particularly on the cyber and critical and emerging technologies front, perhaps to a lesser degree on the infrastructure front, because infrastructure, with the exception of Japan, is not exactly the strength of any of the Quad countries. So let me leave it at that for now, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Ms. Noor. And the last two questions that you raised previously, we will surely return to those. But last but not least, we have Bu Penny. Bu Penny, so what are your thoughts on the recent developments that you have observed in the Quad?
Okay, thank you. Good morning, selamat malam, everyone, and good morning to Ambassador Piper Campbell, Professor Dewi Fortuna Anwar, and Miss Elina, and my dear friend Mabda. I would like to thank FPCI and the US Embassy here in Jakarta for inviting me in this Women in Foreign Policy public discussion series. Actually, it is a pleasure for me to be here, and as a fellow student, I'm also honored to share my views with all the experts. Honestly, being the last person to speak is difficult or maybe easy, because all the speakers have already covered some important points. But in relation to what Magda asked about the questions, I think to describe the development of Quad, I think the development of Quad has been impressive. It's been noteworthy. The field of cooperation from Quad 1.0 to what now we call as a Quad 3.0 has been broadened. As we know that the emergence of Quad was basically driven by the idea of humanitarian assistance or disaster reduction. But now we see that we are now watching the improvement, even the idea of enlargement and embracing the East Asian countries to involve in the Quad. So actually, before we discuss about what the Quad means for ASEAN, I would like to say that the revival of the Quad could support peaceful and prosperous in the Pacific, because Quad is trying to build a habits of dialogue. That's what I see among the 4 member countries, but hopefully we'll also support dialogue with other countries in the region. So that's what my impressions about Quad and the development. And before talking about the meaning of Quad for ASEAN, I think there are 2 important points that we need to consider. The first one is that it is important to note that Quad and also ASEAN are 2 different types of actors. They are 2 different species. They are 2 different regional cooperation frameworks with their own distinctive characteristic and approaches in their own track of development or evolution as an actor. So Quad is a diplomatic informal network, while ASEAN is a regional institution applying its own unique Asian way when dealing with issues. So these 2 groups, however, have similar objectives in creating a peaceful region in the Indo-Pacific. So there's a concern that Quad will replace the role of ASEAN. Quad will also dilute Asian centrality or even try to challenge Asian unity. In this case, I think I would argue that since the 2 are different species, so the 2 cannot be seen as competitor. As an informal alignment, Quad may expand its scope to include some issues and also build some working groups and ad hoc working groups, something like that. I think Quad needs to collaborate with ASEAN as an organizations to achieve some of the objectives. So since the 2 actors are a different species, I would say that the only option for them is to stand together to complete each other's works. Quad may want to work on issues that ASEAN is not able to work, or maybe just to complement what the ASEAN have done. We know that, as Ms. Elena mentions, that Quad has already been working on the Quad Vaccine Partnership and also in supply chain resilience initiative. So I think Quad and ASEANs could synergize more to generate the peaceful region. And if we remember that actually the emergence and development of a Quad was actually to some extent facilitated by ASEAN, because Quad members' first meeting happens in the sideline of the ASEAN meeting. So I see that ASEAN and Quad can work together. And the second point that is related to the first point that I mentioned is that there are diverging types and also priorities of the Quad members. This is also highlighted by Ambassador Piper, that Quad members actually do not adopt similar perspective in some issues. So I think it's difficult for Quad to produce single approach to some issues, because we also know that there is a lack of institutional structure because Quad is in an informal cooperation. I think there are some important cooperation or room for potential cooperation between Quad and ASEAN. One of the issues or one of the areas of cooperation is in maritime security. This is a possible area of cooperation between the two actors, and there has been collaboration between each of the member of Quad with ASEAN. For example, there has been United States and ASEAN cooperation as a dialogue partner or maritime security, and there has been a summit in February 2016 with Japan, with India and Australia. ASEAN have already done some of the maritime cooperation, and joint exercise between Quad and member of ASEAN has also been conducted. Like, for example, Malabar, Kakadu, these are some of the joint exercise that has been done. But I agree with Ibu Devi perspective that, and indicated by also by the survey, that there is a change of perception towards Quad, that there's actually when Quad changed the perspective, it's that it's focusing on China, the perceptions of the people in South Asia would be different when now Quad is evolved. So I think the point is that
Ibu Dewi, sorry, I think if you could please conclude your statements
yes.
in a few seconds, please.
Yes, so I think the Quad and ASEAN can work together, so there is no competition between the two. The two can complement each other. I think that's all. Over to you, Mabda.
Thank you, Bu Penny. You raised very important points on the complementarity between ASEAN and the Quad, and that's something that we will surely touch upon in the subsequent session. So I think drawing from all of these statements from the remarks from the speakers, I think it's interesting also to note that some of the questions, some of the points raised were pretty much concerned on the US presence in this Southeast Asia. What does the Quad, what impact would the Quad have towards the US presence, and of course its presence vis-a-vis China in Southeast Asia, as well as its complementarity and its ability to supplement what has been done in ASEAN. So I would like to begin by asking one of, I think, a very fundamental question, which I believe a lot of scholars and observers studying the Pacific has been asking. Given that in the beginning, in the Pacific constructs, that the Quad, particularly the US and ASEAN envisioned, were not necessarily similar, because on one hand, we have the Quad who was seen to be more exclusive with its Indo-Pacific construct, i.e. some extent isolating China, whereas ASEAN offers a more inclusive vision, which of course China has supported as well. So given that context, how much has visions on the Indo-Pacific changed among ASEAN and the Quad member states? I believe that this is something that has been previously touched upon a little bit, but Bu Dewi, what are your thoughts on the changing ideas or visions on the Indo-Pacific in the last few years?
Yeah. Well, I think, we are living both in a real world, a realist world, and a constructivist world. So for, as you mentioned, Nabila, ASEAN's approach has always been inclusive. It has tried to bring all sides together and to act as a bridge between different sides. And that will always be the DNA of ASEAN. But ASEAN countries are not naive either. We are also very cognizant of the real threats that exist in the Indo-Pacific region. And ASEAN does not have any particular approach to how do we deal with traditional threats to security. Within ASEAN, some countries like Indonesia are non-aligned. some countries are aligned. The Philippines has revived its alignment, military, strengthened again its military alliance with the United States. Vietnam, which fought a long war against the United States, has now entered, a very robust security cooperation with the United States because of concerns about China's policy in the South China Sea. It's not surprising that Vietnam and China are both claimants in the South China Sea, and they're very concerned about China's behavior there, like the militarization of the islands. So here, that's why I say, the ASEAN as a whole does not have a particular standpoint about the Quad. The questions are about what as particular ASEAN nationals think about the Quad. But as far as I know, ASEAN as an institution has never issued a comment about the Quad, and I don't think that it's likely to do so, because different countries would have different perceptions, even within countries with different perceptions about it. So it is not going to be politically correct for me publicly as an Indonesian to say it's good that we have the Seventh Fleet, to secure our neighborhood. But the fact of the matter is, from the realist perspective, ASEAN is not well equipped to deal with real threats to security, and that has always been the business of the U.S. hub and spoke relations to do that. And there's never been any questions about the U.S. should not be allowed the freedom to carry out that, and that we have taken that for granted. In fact, the concerns have been when the U.S. has not borne this responsibility, and now the U.S. Particularly since President Trump has asked its allies and partners to bear more responsibility to providing this traditional security goods, and ASEAN countries have different opinions about that. So I agree with Ibu Penny here that ASEAN and Quad are two different species. The Quad is probably working more towards providing more traditional aspect of it. Although India is not aligned, and so how India has changed its policy to increasingly a closer security cooperation with the United States. That is because of the dynamics of India-China relations. But there will be concerns, coming back to the earlier remarks by Ambassador Campbell about ASEAN as a bureaucracy. ASEAN as an organization is very jealous of its centrality. And ASEAN's leverage in the past has always been that the ability of ASEAN to work as a group while facing a dialogue partner, a group versus a single dialogue partner. The only difference is when ASEAN faces the EU, But with the other countries, whether it's the China, Japan, the United States, and so on, ASEAN has been able to negotiate deals on individual basis. Now, there'll be a big question mark, how it will be if the Quad becomes a solid unit faced with ASEAN, how central could ASEAN be? What kind of leverage could ASEAN continue to exist? But I said, it would be very tricky if within the East Asia Summit, where, you have the ASEAN and plus all the dialogue partners, suddenly it's ASEAN, it will be ASEAN plus Quad and plus, other countries. That would be rather tricky for ASEAN. And so I too, like some of the other countries, there are concerns about how it would impact ASEAN centrality, particularly when the ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific on those areas, maritime security, SDGs, economic cooperation, and connectivity. It would be much easier for ASEAN to work with individual countries, and hopefully it will not just be ASEAN plus Quad and then the BRICS on the other hand, because that would make it much more difficult to find commonalities. It would be much easier, ideally for us in the ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific is not simply to bring ASEAN and the Quad countries or ASEAN the BRIC countries, but there'll be projects where members of the Quad countries can also work with ASEAN plus China and other countries. That will make it much more meaningful in an inclusive regional architecture.
Thank you, Professor. And with regards to the inclusivity of the Quad itself, I think I would like to go back to one of Ms. Noor's point on how the reason for minister's statement showed that the Quad has listened to demands or voices from Southeast Asian, perhaps to some extent Pacific Island countries as well, and just to some degree, I think that sort of address the sort of concerns that has been voiced among ASEAN members in ASEAN on how on the defense orientedness of the Quad itself. So to Ambassador Piper, with regards to the uneasiness or discomfort to the Quad that has been evident in certain ASEAN member states as an individual, how successful has the Quad been in addressing those sort of discomfort?
I think that the ASEAN when ASEAN put out the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific, that was an extremely important development because it was moving forward towards creating more of a space of similarity in order to have a conversation about similarities of thinking as well as differences. I want to build on something that Ibu Dwi said about the differences in position among the ASEAN member states and the fact that ASEAN as ASEAN doesn't have a particular approach to security. And I would say then that it's important to kind of keep that in mind, that among the Quad, there are certainly areas of commonality of interest, but not necessarily commonality of approach. And I think we especially see India in that space as creating some limits on where the Quad security conversation can go or will go. And because of that, I think it's not surprising that the Quad at both the leaders level and then within the Quad working groups is actually kind of expanded its areas of interest, looking at things like climate, cyber, critical and emerging tech space. I find a little bit of an odd area for the Quad to be looking at, but these are all areas where the Quad has established basically leaders level discussions, working groups, and in addition to, we've already talked about health and emerging health threats. I think this sort of redefinition of security moving into some non-traditional security areas has created new spaces for the Quad and ASEAN to interact, both the Quad as 4 and ASEAN as 10, but also sort of starting to build what Secretary Blinken has described as a lattice work of connections, of connectivity, where all the different parts of that lattice work play different roles. And so creating more of a space to say, if this is an area in which your country is interested, you're welcome to be part of this conversation. And then so identifying which aspects of those shared interests would logically be covered within an ASEAN-led forum versus other forums. I think that's something that we're going to see more of moving forward.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think another point that would also be interesting to be discussed is the sort of perception that the Quad, I understand that the distinction that Ibu Penny has raised about the distinction between the Quad and ASEAN, but I think Keiko has also mentioned how it will be interesting also to see the Quad versus versus ASEAN in terms of their productivity and ability to deliver results. And in terms of delivering results, I believe that is something that we have also seen in a lot of critics directed towards ASEAN. So in terms of whether the Quad being perceived as the more result-oriented grouping versus ASEAN being in a lot of ways being seen as the less productive one, do you, Ms. Noor, see, is there any sort of do you think the concerns over this lack of productivity is something that ASEAN will need to urgently address in the coming years? Ms. Noor, please.
It's still early days to assess the efficacy of the Quad in some of the initiatives that it has announced. So it's striking to me how very ASEAN-like in a way what the foreign ministers, the Quad foreign ministers statement was to ASEAN, in that it went issue by issue, and it's actually quite long, like ASEAN statements. But also, there have been a number of plans and initiatives that the Quad has announced in like climate change mitigation and public health preparedness that are still to be fleshed out. So as I mentioned earlier in my remarks, the vaccine diplomacy part actually fell short, and it was announced in spectacular fashion, and then delivery kind of fell flat. We're still to see and assess how these other initiatives and strategies that have been recently announced will pan out over the next few years. A lot of it depends on funding, of course, and some funding has been allocated, but there haven't been many details that have come out. So in terms of comparing the efficacy of the Quad to ASEAN, I think as other speakers have pointed out, ASEAN operates in different areas, some of which overlap with the Quads, but I don't think we're comparing apples to oranges. And even if we were comparing fruits in general, we haven't really seen the results of that on the Quad side, at least.
Thank you. But do you see that, given that how the Quad has become less and less ad hoc, would you say that even though that at the moment the delivery has fell flat, in what areas do you see that the Quad will most likely prosper, especially vis-a-vis Southeast Asia?
I think public health is certainly a promising area. And as I mentioned also in my remarks, some of that work has already been taking place over a number of years, and hopefully it will continue, because that remains a core challenge for many Southeast Asian countries. We've had SARS before, we had to deal with COVID, and who knows what new infectious disease will pop up in the next few years in Southeast Asia. But it's, I was actually struck by an earlier comment about reactions to the Quad, because I think in some ways the Quad has benefited from focus on it and criticism of it with the creation of AUKUS. There was controversy over the creation of AUKUS, which kind of tempered a lot of the responses and initial criticisms towards the Quad. But I think we can't help but notice that half of the Quad actually belongs to AUKUS and constitutes 2/3 of AUKUS. And in that sense, a lot of the focus in the Quad on critical and emerging tech, on cyber, on space, is going to be reflected very much in AUKUS and is already being reflected. So that's something that we in ASEAN and Southeast Asia, I think, will be paying attention to. So there are some oddities that the Quad is going to have to deal with, and that also, ASEAN is going to have to deal with in terms of working or not with the Quad on different issues.
Great, thank you. And I mean, given that Ibu Pen especially mentioned that and also the previous speakers have also multiple times emphasized that it would not be apple to apple to compare the Quad and ASEAN, and Ibu Pen also has advocated for seeing both as complementary forces. For Ibu Penny, what do you think, what form of engagement would be ideal given possible developments in the future? For example, the plan to strengthen the EAS, the East Asia Summit, and future efforts to mainstream AOIP especially.
Well, thank you. Since we know that what the Bu Dewi said, that we are not living in a realist and constructive world, I also want to add that what we are facing now is the relation between the traditional and non-traditional issues. So in this case, there is no other option than to work together in any issues. So it could be non-traditional issues that we can do between Asians and the Quad. I think that is the most possible cooperations between the two, and also the cooperations should be initiated by dialogue first, because we also hear that Quad is also thinking of enlarging the member. This should be a careful consideration before doing this, because each of the Asian members have relations with China, having a good economic cooperation with other countries as well. I think that is what I'm thinking of, possible cooperations between the two, Mabda.
Thank you, Bu Penny. And given that, given your points before, I think it will also be interesting to note that the Quad leaders and ministers have repeatedly noted their concerns on the Myanmar crisis, which I believe has become one of the issues that has become such a huge stumbling block to ASEAN, both for its unity and its standing and credibility as a regional organization. But if we look into the statements by the Quad, aside from reaffirming their support for ASEAN, they have also maintained their support to the 5-point consensus. And at the same time, I think it's also interesting because India is also quite an interesting actor within the whole spectrum of the Myanmar crisis. So with that in mind, do the speakers think that the Quad can do more to address the Myanmar crisis? Or is their support for ASEAN-led efforts to date has been sufficient? Bu Devi, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, okay. First, I'd like to answer your first questions about Quad enlargement. Well, of course, if you enlarge it, it's no longer the Quad. It will be the Quint or the whatever. I do not think that there should be a formal enlargement, but the Quad can carry out cooperation, various functional cooperation with different ASEAN countries, and depending on need. So I think for ASEAN, the primary regional organization would remain ASEAN, and there is concerns that, for example, if Indonesia was suddenly to become a full functioning and permanent member of the Quad, it would raise a lot of questions about whether ASEAN is still the cornerstone of Indonesia's foreign policy and its commitment, and so on and so forth. So I would argue that in various areas of cooperations, Quad can invite one or two other countries, on issues that are of common interest. But for ASEAN, I think that it should not be seen as diluting, the commitment to the regional organizations. Now, I don't think there is a Quad policy regarding Myanmar, because the individual Quad countries probably have different approach towards Myanmar, and different level of commitment. On the one hand, I really welcome all of this statement that all the dialogue partners, including the Quad countries, say that they support the ASEAN 5-point consensus. But I do hope that doesn't mean that it is just delivering the buck to Myanmar. That's your problem. You sort it out, and and then we support you. But we are not there. The whole point of having the Quad countries, for the 3 countries in particular, United States, Japan, and Australia. These are particularly Japan and the United States. These are countries that have a lot of resources that can actually deliver, concrete assistance, humanitarian assistance, and so on. That could make a difference. And we strongly believe that they could assist ASEAN in particularly in the humanitarian dimension. On sanction, Japan has a lot of clout. I'm not sure to what extent the United States economic engagement with Myanmar would really hurt Myanmar if it is stopped, because Myanmar has been long under sanction. But Japan, has a lot of activities there, so it can hurt where it matters, if it was to deprive that. But here, the Quad countries are not really the critical countries when it comes to leverage Myanmar. It is China. And within the Quad, it's India. And here, I think that ASEAN should express its concerns with India, not to give succor and recognition to the junta. But also ASEAN, needs to convince China not, to do activities that would actually undermine the 5-point consensus. But in this case, I don't see a Quad policy regarding Myanmar, frankly.
Thank you so much, Professor Anwar. And now we will move on to the Q&A session. So we have received quite a lot of questions through the chat box, but of course, if you would like to raise your questions yourself, you may use the raise hand feature to ask them directly to the panelist. But first, I would like to begin the first round of question by asking some of the questions that we have received through the chat box. So the first one is from Hardian and Shifa Ruhaini. And the question is there any possibility that ASEAN and the Quad could probably open any official engagement channels? And would it be possible for the Quad to conduct cooperation or partnership, and what forms of partnership between the region and the Quad? So of course, with regards to the compatibility between the two, I think it has been touched upon, but I think it will be also interesting to see what sort of room does both of the grouping could leverage on to push for more engagement. So I think I would hand over to Ms. Noor. What are your thoughts on possible ASEAN and Quad official engagement in the future?
Yeah, as I mentioned, I think there are opportunities in the public health space, but also climate mitigation. I did notice that the question asked about China, and look, I think ASEAN is already a sufficient forum for engaging with multiple partners. And I'm not sure that we need an ASEAN plus Quad formation to engage with China. The engagement is already there. The question is whether there's political will on the part of some countries within the Quad to do more with China. And in that way, ASEAN can facilitate that to the best of its ability, which it's already doing to a certain extent at the multilateral level. But I don't know if there's a need for there to be another ASEAN Quad formation for that purpose.
Great, thank you. And I think that's quite a nice segue to the next question, which is in a recent interview, in fact, with the News Straits Times, President Jokowi mentioned that ASEAN should view the Quad and AUKUS as partners. And I believe this is the first official statement or response from Pak Jokowi towards the Quad especially. So I would like to direct this question to Bu Penny. Do you think this showed a shift in Indonesia's attitude towards these groupings?
I think that is a good statement, and it's as you mentioned, this sounds like the first official statement from Indonesia. This shows, I think, it reflects that Indonesia adopts the independent and active foreign policy. We have friends everywhere. We include and embrace any states to work for our national interest and also for regional security. But I also want to add probably in embracing any friends to work for our objective, we also need to work on the clarifications of our agenda. So before we start the cooperation, we also need to know and understand what our expectations. And this also applies to Quad and ASEAN in the future. I hope that the cooperation between these two actors should be supported by the clear agenda at the beginning, so there won't be any misunderstanding could happen between the two actors. And I also want to add, Mabda, to any potential area of cooperation between ASEAN and Quad. I was also thinking that probably the area of critical and emerging technology would be one of the important or a new room for cooperation between Quad and ASEAN. As we know that Quad has already established one of the leader level working groups on technology. So I think ASEAN can also collaborate on this issue. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Ibu Penny. And also have another question to Ambassador Campbell. Given that the Quad is right now ramping up efforts on non-traditional security issues, especially in being the provider of public goods to the region, do you think that the Quad will eventually be realized into a formal security pact? I find this question quite interesting, given that the Quad itself the full name of the Quad is Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, and they have also established a lot of cooperation and military exercise. What would be your take, Ambassador Campbell?
Yeah, so I think that, as you noted, when we think about the Quad and it's the quadrilateral security dialogue, and then part of the real evolution over the last couple of years has been an evolution in the definition of security in terms of what sorts of issues logically would fit into that basket. And it's interesting to me looking at the materials for the upcoming Leaders Summit, Quad Leaders Summit that's going to be hosted in Australia in a few weeks, that some of the language framing that discussion talked about the Quad as being both positive and practical and seeking to provide tangible benefits and offer choices to the countries of Southeast Asia. And so just to cover a couple points, the first would be, personally, I hope that the Quad does not expand. I think that it's important for the Quad to be a mechanism for coordination among the 4 countries which are currently members, but I want to continue to see those countries engage in the region, engage with ASEAN as countries as opposed to a bloc. Because I do think that if we start to see a Quad engaging with ASEAN as 2 separate species, that's where things become complex, and as opposed to being complementary, actually being diminutive. So I would hope that the Quad does not expand in numbers. I would hope that the Quad continues to be a mechanism for coordination among the views of the 4, where you then see that coordination carried out in more country to country and country to ASEAN level interactions, including in these areas like climate change, and as Ibu Penny mentioned, critical and emerging tech, which are, in addition to health, 2 of the areas that I think there's really real space for amplified engagement. But what I would see is sort of a coordinating mechanism among the Quad, with then most of the actual action and activities carried out by the countries in their interaction with the region. And Mabda, I'm not sure if that answered your question. So if you feel like you want to push me on that, please do so.
That's perfect, actually. Thank you so much, Ambassador. I believe that there are a lot of questions from members of the FPCI chapter. So I would like to hand the screen to Cynthia from FPCI UINSA. Cynthia, please, if you could unmute yourself and probably turn on your camera. Or if Cynthia is not available right now, I think Sasabila, would you like to raise the questions yourself?
Maybe Mabda, you can just choose some of the questions to.
Okay, well, while we're waiting, I think there are also questions from. Okay, I think. Okay, that's okay. I think I will just move on to one of the questions from Alfianti from Brawijaya University. She asked, what challenges do you see in implementing the Quad partnerships goals in the ASEAN region, particularly when it comes to advancing women's rights and opportunities? And I think this has been mentioned as one of the Quad's attempt to address issues other than traditional security. So, Ms. Noor, what are your take on this question?
To my knowledge, and I stand corrected, I don't know that advancing women's rights and opportunities is a standalone item in the Quad. But I think this is a gathering that we're in now is certainly one example, and I believe this is with the support of the U.S. Embassy in Jakarta. So I guess that's one example of a Quad country assisting with this particular issue. I think it's hugely important, of course. And I do know that the Quad has unrolled a number of fellowships, 100 fellowships, I believe. I don't know if there is a gender component. Ambassador Campbell would know better. But I do think that as the Quad progresses, particularly in maybe providing more fellowships, not just to the Quad countries, but also possibly to other countries in ASEAN and the Pacific Islands, then there is an opportunity to provide more scholarships and fellowships to women in particular in various areas of those working groups, for example, in pandemic, critical and emerging tech, as well as climate change mitigation. And I think that could really strengthen some of the bonds for the long term between the Quad and ASEAN and Pacific Island countries.
If I can jump here,
Please, Prof. Yeah.
This is of course a question for the Quad countries. To what extent are they willing to subsume their individual countries' contribution to whether it's climate change, or the health or women empowerment to be under the Quad? Because each of the Quad countries, especially as a democracy, you have to be accountable also in your foreign aid to your constituents, and usually, you raise your own flag. So whether the US would be willing to subsume simply, its assistance, so for example, to the FPCI's activities here, women in foreign policy, as the Quad activity, or rather it's the US one. And the same goes to Australia, Japan, and so on. So, I don't know, that is a question. Maybe Ibu Campbell can answer here. Are you willing? Is the United States really going to subsume all activities in the Indo-Pacific other to, a Quad activity, or is it the US activity?
Or double count them. This is the other problem: is if you're discussing something as a bilateral activity or a bilateral priority and communicating it in the Quad space as well for your partners, how do they understand whether these are in fact the same set of activities just being discussed twice, or whether they are two sets of activities? I think there's challenges there.
Right. Yeah, I think that will open up for another sort of real interesting question. But I think one of the questions raised by Esther from the chat box is also interesting. The US and China, of course, the relationship remains complex and sensitive. And as has previously been discussed by our discussion before, there is a lot of questions and points about whether the Quad or whether its engagement with ASEAN is a practice of balancing. Will there be a potential for an actual power struggle in the region? I assume this is in the form of conflict due to attempts to counterbalance to China's growing power and influence in the Indo-Pacific region. How is the ASEAN prepared to face this situation? So I think it's quite interesting, because I think that links back to whether ASEAN unity can be maintained in this sort of environment. What would Ambassador Campbell's take be on this question?
Since it was a question as to whether ASEAN is prepared, I thought this one would go to somebody else. I think it is really valid and timely to be asking, is there a possibility of conflict? And as we see increased tensions, as we see increased points of friction, it is a question which needs to be posed. It's a question that needs to be contemplated. Certainly, the United States administration regularly talks about moving into a space of increased competition and confrontation, but also looking for areas of cooperation and continuing to believe that there are some. And I know the US administration right now is very actively seeking dialogue with the People's Republic of China, really in the space of trying to lessen tensions, find areas for conversation. But then the question, the kernel of this question is ASEAN prepared? And I would say that it's going to be tremendously difficult for ASEAN to prepare or to think about moving into a more contentious era, because as we've already discussed in this session, the member states of ASEAN don't necessarily have the same point of view on this. And so to try within an ASEAN setting to reach consensus among the 10 member states about an approach to increased tensions would be quite difficult.
Thank you. And in reference to that answer, Bupeni, do you think that ASEAN is also prepared to also maintain its centrality given the development that has been going on in the Quad, and also the potential of rivalry that Ambassador Campbell has mentioned? I think the question of centrality is, of course, central to our discussion today. So what would be your take on this, Bupeni?
Yes, thank you, Mabda. Oh, well, I think ASEAN in the near future and the long term will always continue to maintain its centrality because as an organization institutionalized in cooperation framework, ASEAN has already been strong with the support of all the members and also with the tools to implement the objective of cooperation. So I think the development of Quad may challenge, but it's just a test for ASEAN to work more and develop more in a better shape, so we can always prioritize and centralize our norms. I think that's what my take on that.
Great, thank you. And that concludes our Q&A session. But to conclude our discussion today, I would like to invite all speakers to provide their closing statements. Given the points that we have discussed earlier, I would like to ask also another simple question. What do you think the future has in store for the Quad and ASEAN? So again, I would like to start with the same order that we used before. So Ambassador Campbell, what do you think the future has in store for the Quad and ASEAN?
This has been a great conversation. I've really enjoyed taking a part of it, and I'm going to leave today with my brains swirling with new ideas and things I want to think about further. I think that there are going to, I don't think that the Quad is going to structurally change and become and take on new members. I think what we will see is almost grabbing moments of opportunity where the Quad, the 4 members of the Quad plus other countries sort of almost meet in one-off discussions on issues of common interest. And it's going to be a real question as to whether those appropriately would be labeled as Quad plus or simply labeled as these 4 countries plus other countries meeting on or working on joint initiatives. So I think something that we will see is a continuation of the proliferation of groupings focused around specific areas and interests. I also think we will continue to see this expansion of the definition or the understanding of security challenges, continuing to look at non-traditional security challenges in what on the face of it is a security discussion.
Thank you, Ambassador. Professor Anwar, so I believe that you have a lot to say on what the future might have in store for the Quad and ASEAN, especially from the Indonesian standpoint. What do you say? What do you look forward to the most?
I reiterate my position. I'm basically quite agnostic about this. So I'm neither very strongly supportive of it, or neither am I opposed to it. I see that there are, as long as the Quad remains, loose in structure, and it opens the possibility of working as a group, as well as, not detracting, not becoming a rigid organization where the policies of the United States or Japan and Australia could simply be subsumed, and the Quad. I think that we can work very closely with ASEAN. But the most important thing is, for me at the moment, the ASEAN solidity, the ASEAN cohesion, ASEAN centrality is the most important thing for the ASEAN countries. And we can work with various minilaterals on functional issues. But those minilaterals, should work in complementarity, not in competition with ASEAN. And how we perceive the cooperation in the future also depends very much on the unfolding Indo-Pacific dynamics. If threats to security becomes much more traditional, and then ASEAN will develop a position of normative strategic autonomy, but individual ASEAN countries will carry on, based on their own individual security or strategic outlook, and that has always been the case.
Great, thank you, Professor. Ms. Arina Nur, what do you think the future has in store for the Quad and ASEAN? And I personally would be interested to hear, especially within the realm of emerging tech, given your expertise. What are you most excited about, and what do you think we will see in the future?
So I think a lot of how both the Quad and ASEAN develop in tandem or not depends really on the Quad member countries and ASEAN member states. And not just governments, right? Because civil society also has a role to play in pushing the agenda of both groupings. As I mentioned in the beginning, I think the evolution of both the rhetoric and the agenda of the Quad has been interesting. I expect a little flux to continue in that agenda. And I do think that it is up to ASEAN to leverage on the areas of the Quad initiatives that will benefit ASEAN the most. And perhaps as pushback against my own inbuilt bias, I deliberately did not talk much about critical and emerging technologies. But I do think that a lot of the work that is being fashioned right now in that space, really by the Quad countries, ASEAN has some role to play in that, and it can take the form of helping to shape standards, helping to push the discussion on supply chains, because ASEAN is such a key part of high-tech supply chains or tech supply chains in general, but also to fashion the governance frameworks related to tech and whether it's critical, emerging, or existing. And we haven't done enough in that space. We are trying to do this within ASEAN frameworks, but if we can also help shape the rules of the game, we don't have to just be players of the game. So in a sense, that's how I see the future of the Quad and ASEAN, mainly falling back on ASEAN countries themselves.
Thank you. And we also have Bu Penny. So Bu Penny, from your standpoint, what do you think? What are you looking forward to the most in terms of the Quad and how it will likely unfold in the future, as well as its engagement with Southeast Asia?
Yes, Abda, thank you. As I mentioned in my remark previously, since ASEAN and Quad are two different spaces, so I think ASEAN should see Quad as a partner, dialogue partner, and Quad also do the same thing. And both of these two actors should continue to explore potential areas of cooperations, regardless whether it's between individual Quad members or under the umbrella of the Quad itself. And I still hope and also believe that in the future, the habits of building a dialogue would be the central activity of the region. Since the revival of Quad, we can see that dialogue should be the driving force for any considerations for trying to find solutions for the problems that we are facing. I think ASEAN could also benefit more from what the Quad has been working on. The 6 types of cooperation that I have already mentioned could be the room for potential cooperations between the two. So basically, we just have to, accept what what happened now. That's the emergence and the development of Quad is inevitable, and we just have to try to find the benefits by working together. Over to you.
Okay, thank you, Ibu Penny. And that concludes our discussion. Thank you, Ambassador Campbell, Professor Anwar, Ms. Noor, and Ibu Penny for the interesting discussion. And before we end our discussion, I would like to inform you that we will be distributing e-certificates. And to make sure that you will receive yours, do not forget to fill in the online forms available on the chat box. And I would also like to invite the speakers for a short photo session. So maybe the our friends from FPCI could help me with that. Okay, I think it's up. So the countdown will be from me. So if the FPCI is ready, so okay. 1, 2, 3. Another 1, 1, 2, 3. That's great. Thank you so much. Thank you. It has been a fruitful discussion, and I'm sure that the audience found the session interesting and informative. Today's event is available for your watch on FPCI official YouTube channel at Secretariat FPCI on YouTube. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. You can follow our social media handles for more information about our activities, events, and programs. And also stay tuned to our next Women in Foreign Policy public discussion series via Instagram or Twitter at FPCI Indo. So see you at the next FPCI event.